Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Impact of SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19 Volunteer Interest in Clinical Trial Participation in Minnesota. My name is Ryan Muse, and I'll be your X-Talks host for today. Today's webinar runs for approximately 60 minutes, and this presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. Now, webinars are designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved, so please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, you can please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, know that all participants are in listen-only mode, and please note that the event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Nucleus Network, who developed the content for this presentation. Nucleus Network is the only multi-site Phase 1 clinical trials provider located in Australia and the USA. They provide high-quality first-in-human and early-phase trials for biotechnology and pharmaceutical companies across the USA, Europe, and Asia. Located within cutting-edge health precincts, their cost-effective, accelerated clinical development solutions are supported by advanced technology, clinical excellence, and research expertise. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Dr. Trisha Shamp has 20 years of experience in conducting clinical research, including comprehensive protocol writing for early phase programs, PK modeling, translational research, renal PK studies, and advising biotech on FDA guidance for renal and hepatic PK studies, and IND opening protocol creation. She is an advanced cardiac life support instructor, teacher/mentor at medical and pharmacy programs, and advisor to clinical pharmacology online learning platforms. Dr. Trisha Shamp has a PhD clinical pharmacology, PAC, physician assistant, NCCPA board certified, is a board certified cardiovascular PAC with the American Board of Cardiovascular Medicine, as well as a certified surgical physician assistant with the NCCPA. Jeff Cosgrove is recognized as a leading clinical research executive who has provided both strategic vision and operational leadership across a vast array of therapeutic areas during his 30 years in the clinical research field. Mr. Cosgrove is published in industry publications and serves as guest faculty lecturer for the University of Minnesota Masters in Research program. As Vice President, USA, Mr. Cosgrove continues to provide guidance and leadership to his highly tenured cross-functional research team, and is an invaluable contributor of his comprehensive knowledge of therapeutic clinical research studies throughout Nucleus Network. And so now, without further ado, I would like to hand the mic over to our first speaker. Jeff, you may begin when ready.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Ryan, and thank you for all of our participants today for joining to discuss what we find has been an interesting topic in researching in the Twin Cities metropolitan area. Thought I would start out today, before I turn it over to Trish, to give a little background on PRISM research. PRISM is a Phase 1 center that has been operational since 2005. We are in the epicenter of the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area and located literally equal distance between the downtowns of Minneapolis and St. Paul. We focus principally on early phase research, both in healthy volunteer and a diverse early phase patient-based research as well. Most notably, and what we'll talk about today, is our healthy volunteer and our renal impairment volunteer population. About a year ago, we joined the Nucleus Network family, as indicated by Ryan. And now we enjoy a partnership with our brothers and sisters at our Australian sites. With that said, I will turn it over to Dr. Shamp.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and thank you again, everyone, for listening today. So I'm going to get to the heart of our project here, and I get to start out by stating the obvious, that the global impact of COVID-19 has certainly been felt on every facet of life, of which our clinical trial industry has not been immune. I know when the virus began to emerge in China, I was hoping that it would fizzle out and just stay there, but it certainly did not. And as it spread across Europe and began to hit the east and west coasts here in the United States, this was really when PRISM Nucleus Network really made a pivotal decision to not take a watch and see approach. And that was the decision that really set us up as a leader for COVID risk mitigation. Instead, we decided from the very beginning to assume this pandemic was going to be here to stay and thus integrate it into part of our business climate. And thus we began to mobilize our network of resources to come up with effective strategies to maintain workflow. It was validating to see that a study published by CenterWatch showed that nearly 70% of investigative sites indicated their ongoing trials were being delayed, and nearly 80% said that they were not able to start new trials due to the pandemic. As Jeff alluded to earlier, PRISM Nucleus Network, while maintaining a robust healthy volunteer database, also has a very strong acumen in conducting renal pharmacokinetic studies. These are my favorite, and these volunteers are often very fragile and very finite population. So to give it some perspective, to have someone who is on the brink of end-stage renal disease trust you to give them a drug that offers them no benefit just to see how it moves around and is eliminated from the body is not something we take lightly here. So we wanted to measure and understand their perceptions and concerns along with our healthy volunteer participants to ensure our risk plans were addressing their needs as well. The delays of the trials that we were seeing were really due to sponsor-initiated stand-downs, and that was reasonable at the time. New studies were not initiated and ongoing studies were paused. And I remember thinking at the time that, and I still do, the true impact of these delays on new drug development for our future, it's monumental. I don't really think we'll understand that for many years, if ever. And I don't know about you, but what gets me up every day to continue to work hard in this highly regulated and very highly critiqued environment is that we are working on the cures for our future. And we were thinking about people who were hoping for a cure in the next couple of years, and now because of these delays might have to possibly wait a decade longer. And that didn't sit well with any of us. I do think that the FDA did a great job actually in publishing some very reasonable guidelines for sponsors and sites early on that did allow us some flexibility for our workflow. But an area of concern was maintaining a viable volunteer database during such a vulnerable time. Because of the work that we had done early on, PRISM Nucleus Network really set the bar for our sponsors regarding maintaining patient safety and, of course, data integrity for their ongoing studies. This was an unprecedented time. I mean, it still is. And it's a time when the sponsor really did not have all the answers. And you had billion-dollar pharmaceutical companies turning to us and asking, how are you going to do this? Or, you know, how are we going to maintain our study? And we were able to give them comprehensive answers that really served as a benchmark as they consulted with other facilities and organizations. Next, Jeff is going to talk about our survey.
So to kind of jump on Trisha's point, operationally, we were faced with a challenge of maintaining safety for our staff, our volunteers, as well as addressing suspended or postponed studies, particularly in the early days of the pandemic, more so related to our patient-based active trials as opposed to our healthy. Really, it was a reinvention of the wheel, accommodating and establishing a solid COVID mitigation policy, which Trish led, as well as being in constant communication with sponsors, constant communication with our staff in terms of initiatives for COVID mitigation. But in addressing all those, it occurred to us that one thing that we really should survey and investigate, and which really makes the research move, is the volunteer. It always starts with the volunteer and the volunteer's willingness to consider study participation as well as provide informed consent. And so with partnership with Nucleus Network marketing team, we put together a very good survey that we wanted to distribute to two different populations because A, we wanted to see if there was any distinction between healthy volunteers and a patient population, as Trisha indicated, which was at higher risk if exposed to the COVID, as well as just getting an overall feel and feedback from our volunteer database, what was important to them to continue to be active participants in our research studies. What we were also seeing simultaneously was a huge infusion of brand new volunteers, which we suspect was related to economic downturns caused by shutdowns, particularly in the service industries, school populations and things like that. And so we sent out a list of 10 questions, and we had a phenomenal response rate in a very short period of time. We left the questionnaire up for 1 week and had over 900 total responses. And again, these were all individuals in our current volunteer database. The majority of the responses were obviously from healthy individuals, as that volunteer segment is much larger than any one of our patients. And roughly 50% of those respondents had done clinical research at PRISM or other phase 1 centers. But surprisingly, we had almost 50%, which were first time considering volunteering for clinical studies. And I'll let Trish talk about the key takeaways.
So I'm going to present some of the highlights of the survey here. And to be honest, the real highlights were reading the comments. We allowed our volunteers to enter some free text after the various questions, and that was certainly entertaining. As you can see here, 87% of our renal patients were neutral or more likely to participate if COVID-19 testing was mandatory, and that was even higher for our normal volunteers. 25% of respondents were referred by their healthcare provider to participate in a trial at PRISM Nucleus Network, which reinforced our strong reputation we have within our local medical community. 41% stated they would be more likely to volunteer if a trial was COVID-19 related, which is helpful for our marketing and business development departments. And finally, 56% of normal volunteers stated that it was important that trial sites have strong risk mitigation practices. Certainly, there's a theme here that volunteers would feel more comfortable in the setting where there is testing and workplace controls, but also there was a sense of neutrality that at first was surprising. It became clear, however, when we began to read the free text comments from our volunteers that an established trust-based relationship was key in their decision-making. That was evidenced by a volunteer writing, "I've always felt safe at PRISM Nucleus Network," and another stating that "I perceive very little personal threat from the virus, especially in your setting where protective equipment is consistently being used." This next slide again reinforces those themes of testing and trust, with 54% of normal volunteers stating that COVID-19 testing would make them more willing to participate, and 47% saying the pandemic has not influenced their decision to consider participation. I think the volunteers, as Jeff said, own economic potential uncertainty could be part of that neutrality. We didn't measure this, but it's certainly something that we've considered. Jeff, do you have any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, as the shifting landscape in terms of in the state of Minnesota, both from COVID infection rate and overall COVID statistics for the state of Minnesota and Western Wisconsin, as well as the economic climate changing, is worthy of. We will more than likely do a follow-up survey in a couple months to update these results. We are seeing a flattening out in the state of Minnesota, very consistent with the rest of the U.S. We are about average in terms of the rest of the U.S. in terms of COVID statistics, about roughly just over 5% since testing began. Positive rate in the past 31 days, that's been fallen to about 4% positive rate. Hospitalizations and fatalities have flattened out significantly as well. We still are under a mask and PPE mandate in all public areas. Social venues, whether dining halls, bars, restaurants, whatever, there is a social distancing requirement, and that certainly may change as the weather gets colder here. But we've also seen that the economy has improved, defined by the unemployment rate in the state of Minnesota, whereas it's currently at 7.4%. When the survey was taken, it was roughly at 8.5%. And so it'll be very interesting to periodically send this survey out to our volunteer database to see what the reaction and the response is.
Yeah,
Trish?
I agree. So based on our volunteer concerns, we set out to augment their safety by addressing what we felt were 3 key areas in risk mitigation: limit entry, limit spread, and limit myth. So discussing limiting entry of the virus. Limiting entry of the virus should include strict monitoring of business flow and workplace safety measures for staff, volunteers, and vendors. This includes some of the standard aspects we're seeing used everywhere now, and you can see those on the slide. I just want to highlight remote monitoring. We are lucky that at our facility, we have several conference rooms in our building, but not necessarily our unit. So our sponsor monitors can use those when they are on site. If they require to be in the unit to monitor, say, drug prep or dosing, we provide them with full PPE, but using those extra conference rooms really kind of limits their interaction in our unit, and we can limit staff interaction with them as well. Of course, we need to mention COVID testing for research volunteers. PRISM Nucleus Network was one of the first phase 1 sites to require PCR testing of our volunteers entering our locked unit for admit. Early on, when testing supplies were so scarce, it was really our long-standing relationships with our vendors and our reputation with the Mayo Clinic down in Rochester that allowed us to secure supplies and a priority placement for PCR testing. This allowed several of our sponsors to feel comfortable with continuing their protocol at our facility, and this impacted not only our healthy volunteer studies, but as well as our special populations. One additional aspect that's critical for sites to employ is that it's all fine and dandy to have these questionnaires and testing and temperature checks, but what are you going to do when you have a positive temperature, or you have a screening questionnaire where somebody doesn't answer the question like you think or you hope? And that's really where we have thought through all types of case-based approaches and have action plans that are standardized. So no matter who you go to or for the answer, you're going to get the same response. And that consistency is really key. Limiting spread. Let's talk about that. So obviously you don't want the virus to enter your unit, but one obvious way to limit spread is with personal protective equipment. Approved mask coverings, which include N95s, but just as important in our unit is eye protection. And that comes as goggles or face shield. And much to the chagrin of my staff, your eyeglasses for reading don't count. We expect and we monitor that when our staff is working with the volunteer, they are in full covering of exposed mucous membranes. Furthermore, administrative employees who are necessary to be on site, we all have to follow these guidelines for mask coverings, social distancing, and sanitation procedures. Getting back a little bit to the earlier discussion where PRISM Nucleus Network really was proactive in securing adequate supplies of PPE to maintain business continuity, which was critical for us to continue with several of our normal volunteer studies as a result of the management of our critical supply chain. Not on this slide, but important to mention is that we also have sanitation protocols for commonly used surfaces, spacing of beds and treatment chairs to adhere to social distancing. We have our volunteers, despite being PCR negative at admit, still wear masks at all times. And we empower our staff and our volunteer to kind of monitor each other and reinforce that for everyone's safety. But probably the most critical aspect of limiting spread is what are you going to do if you have a volunteer that shows signs of infection? And what complicates this is that we're dealing with a lot of times very, first in man, very early developmental products, and these IPs can have an array of unknown side effects. And that's why at PRISM Nucleus Network, we've adapted our environment to include an isolation room and isolation protocols, and have worked really close with the Minnesota Department of Health, our local hospitals, to allow us to mobilize a volunteer safely by providing a quick assessment and transfer if required. I think a final point I want to make on limiting spread is contact tracing. That is extremely important. And I always encourage sponsors when they start asking about our COVID mitigation to, ask sites, how are you following up on potential exposures from their staff, vendors, and volunteers? And I know that resources, can be limited, but dedicating resources to this, I think is also really important, because it is as the site, it is our responsibility to follow this through. And finally, we have limiting myth, and it's probably my favorite area. We set out really to educate both our volunteers, but also our employees and our sponsors with the right information about whether it was virus pathology, how it spread, testing, et cetera, and exposure controls. We set out early on to address misleading narratives for our volunteers by providing them an IRB approved information sheet on COVID, as well as the opportunity to dialogue with one of the investigators during consent specifically about this topic. And many of them have very good questions about how we are going to keep them safe. And without a doubt, probably the most important thing is transparency. We immediately set up an audit program. So twice a week, we perform internal audits of our adherence to our said mitigation practices across all areas. And our senior management reviews those and addresses areas of concern. As I alluded to earlier, when I mentioned the glasses versus goggles debate, it was and it is a big adjustment for everyone to go from a somewhat free flow work environment to such tight control. And we didn't always get it perfect, but transparency is and always will be paramount. You cannot assume 100% compliance, and an issue in one location can help serve as an example for other locations in the future. And encouraging communication between all levels of authority, ensuring that issues are highlighted early rather than being deferred or kind of tucked under the rug, is really critical to limiting myth. So that's it for me. I'm going to pass it back to Jeff to wrap us up.
Yeah, thanks, Trish. And I'm going to touch back to the limit myth and some of the things Trish was talking about. I think another critical component related to education and training of all of our shareholders, whether it's sponsors, our staff, and our volunteers, is that we have found that the COVID risk mitigation policy is a very fluid document, giving the mixed messages in the media, the political arena. It often leads to confusion by staff and volunteers alike. And so it's critical to stay on top of CDC, Minnesota Department of Health guidelines. I would believe in about 4 months' time, we are already on version 7 of our COVID mitigation policy. And not only sending that out real-time versions to all of our active sponsors, but also the retraining that is critical that Trish has discussed, both for volunteers and staff alike. And so in a way, it's kind of another benefit for the volunteer above and beyond free medical monitoring and subject compensation, is where they are getting an education every time they come into the facility. And I found the staff and the volunteers having very transparent, open dialogues about COVID. And I think that that's a very positive thing. And so in conclusion, Ryan, you can go to the last slide there. Really the core business continuity for PRISM Nucleus Network is the COVID mitigation policy, and what Trish alluded to, the entry, spread, and demystifying or limiting the myth is critical for our ongoing ability to perform clinical research, as well as minimizing the spread of COVID. I'll finish with this thought in terms of statistic. We have, believe we've tested about 350, we've done 350 PCR tests since implementing this policy. And we have had 2 positives to date out of those 350. And so we're very encouraged. We do not take it for granted. We'll continue to be vigilant. But I thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you very much for that insightful presentation. Before we begin the Q&A session, though, I'd like to draw our audience's attention to the handouts module within GoToWebinar that includes a PDF document available for you to download in relation to today's presentation. So now I would like to invite our audience to continue sending their questions or comments at this time for the Q&A portion of this webinar. I've already received some questions, so we'll get started with those. Our very first question asks, were there any surprising conclusions regarding the survey results?
I thought for me it was the neutrality, honestly, and I really felt that volunteers would be on one side or the other, but there was a large percentage that were very neutral. And like I said in my presentation, a good majority of that could be teased out in the free text comments, where a lot of these people had done studies with us even during at the early days of the pandemic, and saw us reacting to maintain their safety, and they trust us. You know, we consider our volunteers just as an important part of our family at PRISM Nucleus Network as our sponsors and our employees. These people have often done many studies with us over the years, and they want us to continue to do studies. And so for me, I was surprised on the amount of neutral answers we got.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I paid special attention to the renal impairment results, given again the enhanced risk or complications if exposed to COVID. And I was surprised, to Trisha's point, about the number of renal impairment patients who obviously were concerned, but not to the point where it would impact their interest. Interestingly, and something we failed to talk about in the discussion is that it was also critical when resurrecting or restarting our renal impairment PK studies, is that another stakeholder was the nephrologist, the volunteer's clinician. and making sure that they were updated on our COVID mitigation, were aware of what procedure measures we were taking, which then reinforced to the volunteer that safety was the priority at Prism Nucleus Network.
Absolutely. When you have multiple layers of healthcare providers indicating the same thing and supporting their trial participation, that is certainly very good. Feels very good on behalf of the volunteer. I would agree with that.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Our next question would like to know, how long do you think we will see an impact on patient participation due to COVID-19?
I really don't see that we have had that much of an impact at our site. I mean, Jeff can speak to this a little bit more, but we have seen an overwhelming influx to our healthy volunteer database for sure. That's very robust, and the amount of new volunteers I am seeing come through the unit is very encouraging. And due to a lot of the work from home models being executed now, we're getting people in that might have not have considered doing a research study before because they're at work physically, and now they can bring their laptop in, make some money, and stow it away for when they can go travel again. And so we're seeing all different types of people from different backgrounds, and I think it's been encouraging.
I agree. And so in terms of healthy volunteer, just some broad statistics, we've seen the largest growth of our healthy volunteer database since pandemic began is 35 to 55-year-old healthy volunteers, which is surprising. I thought it would be skew younger, those that were either in college or recent high school graduates, but it's actually been on the older of the traditional healthy volunteer age range. So that was interesting. The renal volunteers, at least as it relates to Prism Nucleus Network's renal volunteer database, we already have a very good sense through previous surveys at other times as to what their principal motivations are to participate in these renal PK studies. And believe it or not, financial, while a top 3 motivation, is not always and rarely is the number 1. This particular patient database is really driven by the altruistic understanding that while there's no direct health benefit in doing these studies, they understand that previous generations of individuals with CKD or chronic kidney disease volunteered for these studies years ago, which has had an impact on their dosing regimens for the medications they need now. And so in talking to these people, when they've come back to the research unit, interestingly, that was still a motivator strong enough where as long as they protected themselves, they were not going to allow COVID to stop their trial study participation, which I think is fascinating. So in terms of overall impact and how long it's going to be, it's probably going to be more towards the first time individuals considering volunteering for clinical research. But I really think we're at that point of, if there's such a thing as the new normal, I think we're at right now as it relates to our volunteer databases.
Thank you very much for that in-depth answer. Our next question asks, do you think that Minnesota is indicative of other major U.S. research hubs?
Jeff, you can take that one. I would say probably
Go
not.
ahead, Trish. I can only
focused on Minnesota. I really don't know what's going on.
I'm not sure what context the questioner is asking as it relates to comparing COVID infection rates in other phase 1 hubs or the COVID mitigation policies. I know anecdotally that the sites that we work with frequently, particularly as it relates to patient-related studies, we have a wonderful collaborative dialogue. Everybody wants to succeed and be able to keep people safe. And so there's a fair amount of sharing of information. As it relates to COVID mitigation, and I think Trish touched upon this earlier in the presentation, we were aware that, and based on sponsor and other clinical phase 1 sites feedback, that I think we were a little bit ahead of the game in terms of hammering down a very formal COVID mitigation policy, whereas other sites were more of a wait and see, how is this going to shake out? But I think right now, as of today, I think out of necessity and standardization, I know the sites, regardless of where in the US, are very much in alignment in terms of consistent policies. There might be differences here and there, and that's, for sponsors and the volunteers to ask their respective sites as to what their policies are.
Thank you very much. Our next question would like to know, what do you recommend to address the reluctance of participants?
Oh, yeah, I'll take this one. Absolutely. I work with the recruitment department. They need to be directed to an investigator straight away. The investigator team needs to address these concerns in an open forum, honestly. When I consent volunteers, I tell them this is, congregate living, and we definitely, even though we PCR test you and you have to be negative and you're social distancing and you're wearing masks, and, I go through all of this in great detail, I'm also transparent with them. We do everything we can, but it's not like staying home by yourself, right? And so that level of honesty and transparency and dialogue really should be with at the investigator level. At least that's how I would practice and how we practice at our site. I really feel that establishes rapport with the trial participant, because they are looking at you to carry them, usher them through this process. And many of these new people coming in that I'm seeing in screening and doing ICF, they've never done a study. I want their experience to be, I want their experience to be blown out of the water, where they, want to come back. And I teach them about the drug just like I was teaching a student. And it's no different being transparent about our COVID mitigation, what we do good and, in areas that we can't do 100%. So they appreciate that transparency and honesty.
That's excellent. Thank you. Our next question is directed towards you, Trisha, and it asks, how are you dealing with the complicated aspects of testing around the SARS-CoV-2 virus, PCR versus antigen versus antibody?
Yeah. Well, antibody we wouldn't use, period. We for sure didn't want to do antigen testing right away, because with antigen testing initially, it was really looked at as a tool for when someone is symptomatic, okay? When the FDA approved some of these newer devices that are more point of care, in their guidelines, they have indicated that it is acceptable to use antigen testing as point of care testing. They've recommended for congregate living like nursing homes, but it's not as sensitive as PCR, okay? So a positive test on an antigen, you would also need to confirm with the PCR. Right now, our turnaround times are so good with PCR testing. I really hesitate to go away from that as our gold standard, but we are looking at antigen testing for those cases where we need an answer right away.
That's excellent. Thank you very much for that question and for all of the answers. But unfortunately, we've reached the end of the question and answer portion of the webinar today. If we couldn't attend to your questions, the team at Nucleus Network may follow up with you, or if you have further questions, you can direct them to the email address that's on your screen. I want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen as you exit, and your participation is appreciated, as it will help us to improve our webinars. Now, I'm about to send you a link in the chat box, and with this link, you'll be able to view a recording of this event on that page, And you can share this link with your colleagues when they register for the recording there as well. So I do encourage you to do that. Now, please join us in thanking our speakers, Dr. Trisha Shamp and Jeff Cosgrove. We hope that you found the webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you for coming.